In the neighborhoods where the city keeps its promises and forgets its failures, Luke Cage learned that power must be practiced before it becomes legend. He learned it in a prison yard and in a corner store, in the way a mother folds a blanket around a child's shoulders, and in the way a neighbor bails out the next man when rent is due. His skin was a miracle in the literal sense, the kind of miracle that made bullets flatten like rain on tin, but it was also an ethical instrument, an agreement between one man and a small, stubborn community, that someone would stand where harm threatened to step in. Luke measured himself in simple things: how many windows he could board before a riot, how many kids he could shepherd down into basements when a gunfight roared past, whether he would answer at 2 in the morning when a neighbor pounded on his door because the world had tilted wrong. Cain Marco was a different story. Exactly how difference becomes destiny is a question older than law, but it begins with a touch, a hand on a stone, a mouth that remembered prayer shouted into a cave, a crimson gem that made promises it had no business making. Where Luke's strength was civic and relational, designed to preserve people and the ordinary fabric of life, Juggernaut's power arrived as a metaphysical fiat. The crimson gem of Cyttorak did not grant mere muscle, it conferred a principle. It translated Cain's hunger for force into an ontological claim: when I move, the universe must yield. That claim is not an ethical position, it is a rule of geometry, a law that resists negotiation. When the gem's light first touched Harlem, it did so through the most human of accidents: the greed of a developer's henchman, the desperation of a petty thief, a mislaid artifact passed like a hot coin from one hand to another. The result was not cartoonish. It was catastrophic in the slow, crooked arithmetic of cities, a facade that had been weak for years finally giving way, a scaffold that had been patched and patched until patching was a superstition. People fled porches and stoops and bed frames, and in the wake of human fear, there rose the two answers the world keeps for ruin. Luke answered with choice, he answered with skill, and with the communal muscle of those who would be saved. Cain answered like a natural law. Their debate began not with a fight but with words, because both, despite the difference in scale, felt compelled to justify their position before fate undid everything. Luke spoke of fidelity. To keep a promise is to make a city livable. To give in to brute momentum is to let the worst impulses of the powerful determine what becomes possible. His was a moral argument with stakes the size of people's lives. Cain, through the gem and through his fists, articulated another philosophy. History is shaped by the immovable, and sometimes what appears as cruelty is simply the articulation of a more primitive verdict, that certain motions are older than ethics. In taverns and on porches, neighbors argued about whether agency could truss against inevitability. Pastors quoted scripture about stewardship, while statisticians muttered about engineering tolerances. The point where the civic and cosmic collided became a tribunal, where both men performed without an audience, one man insisting that responsibility could bend the world by steady, patient acts, another insisting that some forces are not subject to petition. That philosophical scaffolding mattered because it explained motive. Luke did not simply want to prove he was stronger. He wanted to prove that moral endurance could be as decisive as raw power, that cities were kept by human kindness and stubborn work. Cain did not simply want to crush, he wanted to be confirmed, to feel the world answer to a single will. Both narratives were true in small parts, and both were dangerous if taken as totalities. The first chapter of their encounter closed not on a neat resolution, but on a consent to the terms of engagement. Luke would try to save what people he could, and Juggernaut would move because the gem made movement the axis of his being. Each knew the other's grammar now, and that knowledge would prove as important as fists when the struggle turned physical. The dawn came hard and beige, and the battle that followed was less a clash of blows than an argument of scales, a calculus in which ingenuity and obligation tried to outrun the raw arithmetic of unstoppable mass. Luke began where he always began, by turning the city into a problem he could solve with care. He blocked alleys with twisted cars and toppled lampposts into choke points. He lashed scaffolding into anchors, created channels to steer Juggernaut away from the school and the hospital, and trained neighbors into human chains so that the most vulnerable would be shepherded to basements and rear exits. He used the kind of improvisational engineering that only decades of neighborhood living and self-reliance can teach. A crate becomes a ramp, a mattress a buffer, a fallen billboard a shield. For a time, his plans worked like a series of small miracles. Cain struck a barricade, and the air answered with the scream of metal. For all the violence, many people got out. Luke learned once more what he always learned. Speed can be recreated with discipline, and panic can be managed with steady hands. Then Cain answered with the other kind of truth. When Juggernaut came, he did not punch the city, he rewrote it. A push from him sent a row of cars climbing over a curb and turned a strip mall into a temporary causeway. Luke hit him again and again, pushed, twisted, tried to change a vector, but his blows landed against an expression of inevitability. Where Luke's strikes might dent a lesser opponent, here they were timed against something that made the sound of impact seem apologetic. Fists met an answer that was not flesh but the gravity of a mandate. Luke escalated by necessity. He tried changing geometry. Cranes hoisted twisted I-beams to pin Juggernaut, only for cables to snap under a pressure that made steel groan as if pleading. He sought drag, tried to drive Cain toward the river. Cain's boots punched through water and crumbling concrete as if the world were nothing more than a surface for him to impose direction upon. Each tactic produced not only failure, but a different kind of enlightenment. The cleverer the plan, the more spectacular the counter. Yet every failure contained the narrower, human victory Luke needed. Seconds that were translated into lives saved. He hauled children from stoops even as windows collapsed. He carried an old woman from a porch while a bakery's roof folded like paper above them. Between blows there were moments when Cain's memory cracked like glass and the boy who wanted a father's attention peered through, but the gem's logic closed the gap. Hesitation was brief and the forward vector reasserted itself like tide. In the fight's long arithmetic there was a crucial sequence on a derelict elevated rail. Luke, thinking in terms of geometry again, maneuvered Cain along a stretch whose supports had been undermined decades earlier. He did not seek to bury the man but to steer the fall away from the school. He leapt onto a rail and took a strike that rattled his teeth and shed blood across dust for a breath he could not rise. The supports finally gave in a catastrophic arc. Steel screamed and the track folded, the wreckage falling in a line that beat air and earth into a new map. Juggernaut punched through the ruin with the terrible inevitability of a comet through atmosphere and stood, gem pulsing like a heart that does not know remorse. Luke found himself dragging his own body from the debris, every inch a ledger of promises kept. In the aftermath, the philosophical verdict stood thick as dust. Juggernaut had won the exchange in the most literal sense. His forward vector had not been arrested, his will had not been bent, but Luke had won something essential too. The number of people alive at dawn, the children ushered into basements, the old men pulled away from stoops. These were not trivialities, they were the moral yields of a stubborn ethic. There is a value in preventing harm, even when you cannot stop the cause of it. Cain walked away because his victory was not an act of malice, but the execution of an imposed ontology. He was an instrument of a mythic law that spoke in movement and redefined stoppability. The city would have to rebuild around both of them, around a man who refused to be stopped, and around a man who refused to stand aside. The philosophical conclusion was not a defeat of one view by the other, but an uneasy reconciliation. Sometimes the world contains forces that are not subject to our better angels, and sometimes those angels still matter badly in the work they do to shield the vulnerable while catastrophe passes. Juggernaut's win was decisive because he carried a scale that converted possibility into inevitability. Luke's resistance was meaningful because it bought life and conscience in the margin. In the end, the winner was established in the simplest register of consequence. Juggernaut moved. What he moved could not be fully undone by human will. Luke remained a victor of a different kind, the keeper of the neighborhood's bargain, the man whose courage made recovery possible. Both legacies would sit uneasily together in the city's memory. One, the cautionary tale of forces that reshape topology, the other, the stubborn moral proof that even when scale overwhelms, agency still saves people. The battle closed without fanfare. Cain's footsteps faded, and Luke's hands were loosed by dust and by the heavy peace that comes after taking what pain must be taken to spare another.